involved in lobbying for government contracts than really producing, weapons to the characteristics that the government needed. And I think that's sort of the area in which, we have to be the most concerned is whether companies like Lockheed Martin and others are more interested in figuring out how to get money from the government than they are in making useful products.
Well, you always, Americans keep falling for this idea over and over about a peace dividend. The Cold War ends. Oh, great. We don't have to have this buildup against the Russians anymore. We can have a peace dividend. We can save that money. And the end of Vietnam War, we don't have to spend that anymore. Or if or when we ever get out of Afghanistan, and that's a big if, I guess. But it never seems to materialize. There's always some new threat out there, some new thing we got to spend a whole bunch of money on.
Well, yes. At the end of the Cold War, Colin Powell said, I'm running out of enemies here. And in part he meant no Soviet Union. In part he meant how would you sustain a large military budget without somebody to point to as a need. And so their strategy turned to what they thought of as regional powers like Iraq and North Korea, which, of course, were dangerous to their people, dangerous to their regions, but didn't necessarily pose a direct threat to the United States at the time that this strategy was developed. And so, even given the need to perhaps deal with those countries, the military budget and the military industry was much larger than would be necessary to deal with that kind of threat. So there is an element, and even sometimes the companies are involved in coming up with studies, with arguments, with, serving on government panels that talk about threats that are sometimes exaggerated, which then help feed the complex and feed not only the companies but the bureaucracies in the Pentagon, which depend to some degree for their own size on continuous sense of threat and also large inputs of government money.
Your book starts with what you could call Exhibit A, and that's the F-22, the Raptor. Where I live, I'm just a mile or so from Nellis Air Force Base. I would hear the Raptors fire up every morning, very loud, very cool planes, a lot of capabilities that have been described by the Air Force, what they can do and how superior they are to anything else in the world. The chapter you write about the Raptor, though, sort of incorporates all the trickery of the trade, all the kinds of things, the rabbits that Lockheed has pulled out of its hat to keep programs going, even when the Pentagon doesn't want them. Tell us that. Take a couple of minutes and tell us the story of the F-22 and what kind of tricks were pulled.
Well, there came a point, there were several points, but the most recent point when Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said, we've got this plane, it may well be capable, but we don't really have a use for it. We're fighting two wars, and even with two wars, it's not being used. It's the most costly fighter plane that's ever been built, and although it's got significant capabilities, they're not capabilities that we necessarily need right now. But the company begged to differ, of course, because it was an important source of revenue for it. So one of the things it did was make the jobs argument. They put a series of ads in the Washington Post designed to be a veiled threat to members of Congress that if you vote against this, then we're going to point out that there's jobs in your state, be it in Connecticut, be it in Mississippi, be it in Chicago. They mentioned 8 or 10 different companies and states in their ads that would have job loss if we didn't build the F-22. And one thing I found interesting is that they overstated the amount of jobs involved. They talked about 95,000 jobs. They made it sound like if this thing was ended, those jobs would disappear tomorrow. But in fact, I looked at sort of standard estimating procedures that are used to figure out how many jobs $1 billion in the industry would create, and it was more like 30 to 40,000, not 95,000. And it also appeared that a lot of the states that they mentioned had little or no activity. They claimed they were in 44 states. So this exaggeration helped, sort of bolster the jobs argument. But in this case, despite that, the Congress eventually voted against it. And I think that was because of the arguments of Secretary Gates, the fact that it wasn't needed, the fact that there were other equipment that were more relevant to the wars that were being fought. But a couple interesting things happened. First of all, we built 187 of these things when many times before the need had been questioned. They had won the day with some of these same arguments about the jobs. But also they got a little sort of kicker, a little payoff at the end because the $4 billion that was reduced from the F-22 was increased for the F-35, another Lockheed Martin plane. So basically they came out even on the deal, and now the F-35 itself has had cost overrun problems, performance problems. It's not clear we should be spending so much money so soon until the kinks are gotten out of the system. But in order to make the company happy and kind of reduce that lobbying pressure, this money was, spent basically a way to, if not pay off, at least mute the criticism that the company would bring to bear on the government otherwise.
Why wouldn't they use them in Afghanistan or Iraq, just at least to pretend as if they were needed?
Well, in neither place were there. It's really designed to do aerial combat with other fighter planes, and so Al-Qaeda doesn't have an air force.
That's right.
Iraq's air force was taken out pretty early in the conflict. So there's plenty of other ways to drop bombs that are more efficient than using this plane. So it really was a case of the adversaries we had didn't really match up with the capabilities of this plane. And also, Secretary Gates pointed out that even current generation planes, if they continue to upgrade them, would give us about a 25-to-1 edge over China even 10 or 15 years from now in terms of sophisticated combat aircraft. So there didn't seem to be a present need, there didn't seem to be a future need, and it was, soaking up money that might have been spent on things like, training pilots, things like armored vehicles that might be used, more effectively to protect troops in the field, and also to just look at whether spending $700 billion a year on the military, which is the largest level since World War II, was the most efficient and effective way to protect the country, or whether there was some, fat in the process that could be trimmed and make available either to cut the deficit or invest in other areas.
Isn't there a quote from Secretary Gates somewhere in your book where he says to either Lockheed or to Congress, hey, look, we spend more on defense than the rest of the world combined. A small little cut here or there is not going to make us vulnerable.
Yes, he did say that in a speech in Chicago before the vote on the F-22. And he also said, given the amounts being spent, and in fact the military budget, even without the F-22, continues to go up. He said, given that we're spending more or close to more than the rest of the world combined, only in the parallel universe of Washington, D.C. could people consider that, gutting defense, which was argument coming from a lot of members who had defense industries in their district, and so we're really defending more of a parochial pork barrel interest than a national security interest.
Bill Hartung, author of the new book, Prophets of War. When we come back, I want to get into the idea of Congress as a willing and able partner in keeping this whole charade going. Stay with us, everyone, on Coast to Coast. Allman Brothers taking us into the break. Talking with Bill Hartung about Lockheed Martin and whether or not it is the military, it is morphed into sort of the military-industrial complex that Ike Eisenhower warned us about. Bill, I don't know if you heard the tease or not, but in the break I was telling the audience how odd it seems to me, as you describe in the book, that there's the Secretary of Defense Gates saying we don't want this thing, it's too expensive, the F-22. It would probably hurt us in other ways. There's cheaper and better ways, better for our security to do this. Let's don't do it. He calls in the head of Lockheed Martin, says, don't be fighting me on this or else. Lockheed Martin backs off, and still this thing almost passed in Congress.
Well, yes, there are members who are kind of on board. Even before Gates made his formal announcement about cutting the plane, Lockheed Martin generated a letter from 44 members of the Senate and 200 members of the House of Representatives saying, we need this thing, for defense, but really we need it for the economy. It's a recession, not the time to be cutting government spending. There's jobs in our states involved. You don't want to be the one who's, sort of tarred with the idea that you've, stopped economic activity in the middle of this recession. So they already had this sort of army of, better than lobbyists, but members of Congress themselves going to bat for them. And so people like Senator Chris Dodd from Connecticut, where the engine was built, Senator Saxby Chambliss from Georgia, where the plane was assembled. They had the Texas delegation because there was some work being done there. So all the sort of major assembly points were the same people who were lobbying in Congress, along with people like the Machinists Union who were involved in some of the production. and so of course had issues about jobs for their members. So it was a true dilemma, given that the economy was not going so well. But the defense budget should not be a jobs program. It really should be about what we need to protect the country, and that was sort of the distortion that was introduced into the process. Was this jobs. We got to keep it for jobs, which of course, pretty much anything you do with the money will create some sort of jobs, including a tax cut. So it was kind of to some degree, a misleading argument.
Is there a case to be made that when it comes to government spending, that defense spending is one of the least productive ways to create jobs, as compared to, say, some kind of domestic spending, or, as you mentioned, a tax cut?
Well, for things like education or mass transit, there's about 2 times as many jobs per $1 billion spent. Things like infrastructure investment or weatherizing homes or alternative energy, about 1.5 times. And then a tax cut, about 20% more jobs per $1 billion if you were to, instead of spending it on the plane, just cut taxes. So it's about the least efficient way available to create jobs, which also undermines a bit the argument of the company that, this is going to be a disaster for the economy, and really it would probably be a net gain in terms of overall jobs.
Again, to emphasize the bipartisan nature of this influence that Lockheed Martin has, I mean, you had people like John Kerry and Ted Kennedy voting for the F-22, again, because of the jobs in Massachusetts, and they're not exactly hawks on defense, and John McCain, probably more important than anyone in stopping the thing, he's not exactly a panty waist when it comes to defense.
No, in fact, this was one of the few cases where McCain and President Obama agreed. They haven't really worked together on too many other issues, but both of them felt like this was a boondoggle. It wasn't needed to defend the country. McCain had a little bit of freedom because it was not majorly produced in his state, whereas people like Barbara Boxer from California, Patty Murray from the state of Washington, other prominent Democrats voted for it, as did Kennedy and Kerry, because of the jobs question.
Tell me, just walk us through it. How does a company like Lockheed Martin get this kind of influence on both sides of the aisle in Congress? I mean, you had Daniel Inouye, who is known for bringing home the bacon to Hawaii. He gets up and says there's no jobs in Hawaii. I'm just voting for this sheerly on the issue of national security, which is a bunch of baloney. But what are the tools that Lockheed Martin uses to ingrain itself with Congress, other than, I guess, taking out ads in the home state of the senator or representative and talking about jobs? Well,
they're a big campaign contributor. They're Inouye's biggest contributor. Buck McKeon is going to be the new head of the House Armed Services Committee. They're his biggest contributor. They spend about $12 million every cycle on either lobbying or campaign funding, which is the biggest within the defense industry. They also they hire people who have had important jobs in the government